Is a sovereign fund good for the United States? Is this something that's been proposed by the Trump administration good for the U.S.? Is it something that will help us pay down debts and deficits, or will it create more bureaucracy and more of a drag on the economy? Well, let's take a look at that on this episode of The Steve Beeman Show.
In a world of uncertainty, where business, freedom, and the future hang in the balance, one voice rises with clarity, experience, wisdom, and conviction. This is The Steve Beeman Show, the voice of the independent American.
Welcome back to this episode of The Steve Beeman Show. Today we're going to take a look into something that's been proposed, done by several countries, but is it the right thing for the United States? Should we have a U.S. sovereign fund? These are big issues around the world as we try to deal with the debt and deficit of the United States. Could this help? Well, let's take a look at it. There are several examples, and I want to go into what a sovereign fund is first, because it's the fundamentals of that make a difference for you and me. At the core, a sovereign fund is no more than a government-owned private equity fund. It uses government funds typically generated by a surplus, oil surplus or other surplus, to invest it in segments of the economy it deems to be important. In this case, here in the United States, the Trump administration has suggested it make investments in semiconductors, energy, other things of strategic importance. Well, this sounds good on paper, but is it one of those things that, as we often hear, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? Well, I want to take a look at it with you and discuss it, because we do have countries around the world like Norway. They've got a sovereign fund. China has a sovereign fund. Dubai has a sovereign fund. Abu Dhabi has one. Singapore. These are big funds. These are $1 trillion plus funds. Now, if the U.S. came in, it would more likely, it's been proposed, be something like $3 trillion. So it would dwarf all of the other sovereign funds. But again, is that a good thing? A number of other countries do this. Primarily, as you look around the world, it's countries that are driven off oil economies, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, those types of things. Norway's a unique example because it has a very efficiently well-run government with surpluses every year, so it uses those surpluses for the sovereign fund. The common thread among those nations is they have a surplus. That's a huge thing. That is not exactly in line with the United States. Secondly, in some of the cases, they have very strong authoritarian governments like China, where there isn't dysfunction in the government. Hard word to use because I think the whole thing is dysfunctional. But in terms of efficiency and operations, they operate very efficiently. So you have Qatar, who's a very wealthy country based on oil wealth, and the Middle Eastern countries. So these sovereign funds exist to give a government a private equity exposure into its economy. The common thread, again, is they have oil surpluses, trade surpluses, or other surpluses, where they can use that money to make these investments. But as much as that, they also have in common, more often than not, a country that's not overrun with debt, deficits, and dysfunctional government. I want to talk about that a little later in the program, but that notion of dysfunctional government is enormously important to this. So let's take a look at that. I mean, we're running in this country, obviously, big deficits and debts, and we don't exactly have, and this isn't political. You could love or hate Trump. You could love or hate the Democrats. Doesn't really matter. If you look at how our government has operated over the last 50 years, it's not exactly the epitome of efficiency. So let's take a look. But in terms of who else does it, a lot of folks do it. And so Trump has come out now and said, maybe the U.S. should do this. This is an opportunity for, us to participate in private equity and for us to make strategic investments to help these companies. Again, it sounds good, but as I said earlier, oftentimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Let's take a look first at why this could be good. And again, I don't want to make a political bias in this presentation to you. I want you to know why they're good and could be, why they're bad, and let you make a decision on what you think the right approach is. And I'll certainly let you in on where I stand on it as we go through it. But in terms of good, It can create a long-term savings account for a country, or think of it as a nest egg. Now, in the United States case, it could be used to stabilize Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid, or simply pay down the debt that we have. There's a lot of good reasons to do it. Making money off the economy is what the markets do. As the U.S. economy grows, the S&P grows with it. Certain companies grow faster than the economy. Well, the government would like to be in those companies that grow at least as fast as the economy. So that would give a balance to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That sounds really good. Secondly, there's strategic plays here. The U.S. could put money into those industries where it sees a strategic advantage or need for advantage. Again, semiconductors, raw materials and rare materials, energy production. These are things that the United States has declared to be strategically important. And a sovereign fund could be used to pay into investing in those, to give more capital to those segments. Again, that sounds really good. Third, in theory, it will provide wealth for future generations. Again, go back to the nest egg. Because you're putting away capital, and in the United States case, again, we're looking at something like $3 trillion that would be used, and they'd get that money from tariffs and taxation, but it would go into this, and that money could grow over time, again, to protect these social programs or to provide additional capital for the government to do things. Lots of political appeal. On a populist basis, this would be very popular because people wouldn't look through the whole thing. They'd see the surface of it, and again, the intention of it, and they would say, wow, you're putting away a savings account to help support Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and our future generations? Well, we love that. I mean, what's not to love, right? You could also look at this, and it will certainly be presented as a counterbalance to the deficits. If we're running a $2 trillion deficit with these $36 trillion debts, you could look at a U.S. sovereign fund as a counterbalance to that. Again, that sounds really good, and it's going to look good on the surface. So when it's presented to the people, they're going to look at these good things and say, maybe we should allow one. Now, bear in mind that a sovereign fund is not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a quasi-government private business. It provides banking services and banking regulation to the United States economy. This would be a private equity fund. It's akin to owning Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway. I mean, if you're following that, your first question is going to be, well, who runs it? And that leads into why it could be bad. As much as in theory, a private equity fund looks to be a great idea, the challenge of a private equity fund is to invest into industries and companies that actually make money. That's really hard to do, or everybody would do it. So the idea of the U.S. government allocating $3 trillion into the private sector, well, first of all, which part of the private sector? I mean, are you going to pick winners and losers here? Are you going to pick those? I'll give you an example. I mean, you go back to Solyndra. Everybody thought that, green energy was the place to go. So the government put $500 billion or $500 million something in Solyndra. It blew up because it was a bad idea. The government isn't really good at picking venture capital. Now, you could argue that an investment into Intel isn't venture capital, but what happens is you create inefficiencies in the market when you throw capital at companies that may be in distress. Maybe they need capital because they weren't well managed. I mean, go look at during the auto thing. You gave GM money because it had been mismanaged for years. Ford didn't take the money. Ford's a much better investment than GM has been. So do we really want the government going in through a $3 trillion fund and making winners and loser choices? I don't know that I trust them. That ties into the potential distortions in the marketplace. There are no $3 trillion private equity funds, but a $3 trillion capital fund that can invest could distort market prices very dramatically. If they are going to put money into Intel, I guarantee you the Intel stock price is going to rise. Now, that may not be an efficient investment, but you talk about a heyday for insider trading. We've certainly seen enough of that in government because it's legal for them. Well, this would give them that on steroids. If you're going to go put $100 billion behind a certain company, do you not think that company's stock's going to rise? Does it not give it advantage over its competitors? So you're creating inefficiencies in the marketplace by virtue of having this massive amount of capital to throw around. So if we look at first the idea of, well, they're going to pick the winners and losers. Secondly, they're going to distort the markets without question. It gets into the third issue, which is what I've called corruption risk. Government and money creates corruption. And if you don't believe that, I urge you to study it more because you can't but not believe that. Government itself isn't a bad thing, but the people who get involved over long periods of time don't have the motives of the people at heart. They have sustaining their own jobs, be it an elected official or a bureaucrat. That creates problems. We've seen massive amounts of stuff with these not-for-profits. Let's go solve a problem. So the Congress authorizes $5 billion, and they give out $5 billion through not-for-profits that they benefit from. I mean, the reality is, in our government in the United States, the equivalency or the putting together of government with money creates corruption. Go look at the insider trading scandals that have gone on. It's never been denied. It's totally legal. But that doesn't make it right. In addition to that, this creates what I think of as like an economy by who you know. And that is it's not fascist necessarily, but it's bad. Because when you know somebody, your company gets money. If you don't know somebody, they don't get money. And that's how government allocated money works. It's not a free market where people compete for free. I mean, in the private markets, it's a little bit who you know as well. I'm not naive. I get that. But at least in the private markets, there aren't mixed agendas. It's all about who makes the most money. So ultimately, good ideas make the most money, and money will flow to the better idea. In government, it doesn't work like that. Oftentimes, money flows to power, and power is a very different motive than profit. So when government starts to allocate money, it allocates it for its own power, not the profit of the enterprise. When private markets invest, they do it for the profit of the enterprise. So in terms of benefiting the American people, the profit motive in the private sector generates growth in the economy. The power motive in Washington isn't. It doesn't generate growth. It's an inefficient allocator of capital. And again, the examples are all over this. TARP, Solyndra, the green energy failures. Government trying to pick winners and losers has failed almost every time it started. So this creates this problem again. If you look at the way Washington has worked, this becomes another slush fund. And you get into this problem. Who runs it? You could be a big Trump supporter right now, and you could be the biggest Trump supporter in the world and say, well, Donald Trump is a brilliant businessman, and he can run it, and he'll make us a lot of money. Okay, Trump's going to be in office for another few years. He's also 90 years old or 80 years old or something. I mean, he's not going to be around forever. Who runs it then? What happens when the opposite political party that you favor gets into power? Are they going to run it with the interest of the American people at heart? Or is it going to become just another government slush fund with money that's used by the politicians? Don't forget Social Security. Social Security was sold to you as an insurance program where you put in $1, it gets returns like a market return, and then you get back your dollar plus the invested return. Well, what the government did is very slick. They went to that big pile of Social Security money and said, why don't we, the government, guarantee a return on it, and we'll borrow the money out. So they created Social Security bonds, which they buy the Social Security cash with these bonds, and then they spend the cash on whatever their favorite pet project is. Because of that, Social Security is loaded up with government bonds, but there's no cash. There's no liquidity. If Social Security had been run privately, it would have been into public securities that are liquid, so you could get the cash back when you need it. So would this sovereign fund become just another slush fund where there's $3 trillion in cash and public market securities in it, but the government says, you know what, we're going to use government bonds and we're going to just borrow that cash? I would tend to think it would go that way. Now, I'm pretty cynical, and I've seen how government works for 50 years. So I do think they would use it as a slush fund. And that's why I tend to go, there's no guarantees this will be run right. No differently when the Federal Reserve was created. Half the country loved it, half the country hated it. And that fluctuates on who's in power and who's the head of the Fed. This sovereign fund would go very well if your political party's in favor. Well, if it's not, and you have a different idea for it, it's not going to be so popular. So you have to be very careful giving government the kind of control this would give them. So that's a pretty blatant statement of mine to say, I don't support this. I think it's enormously dangerous because I think you're giving a $3 trillion slush fund, potentially, to a government that has proven its inability to manage money. They don't have a good track record. You can't manage a company with 435 or 535 CEOs. And that's exactly what we have in Washington. You have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate who are all acting like CEOs. And then you've got a president that some of them are real strong personalities and command and control. Others are kind of weak personalities and let the system run it. You don't have continuity within these things. You don't have good management, and you don't have a sound basis on which to give them a $3 trillion slush fund. So when you look at this and you say, well, on the good side, saving money is never bad. A $3 trillion savings account properly managed could help bail out Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all that. But that assumes that you have competent people running it and competent people in the long run running it. And that's where I think it breaks down. Government motive is not the financial interest of the people. It's power in itself. And whether you could argue that Joe Biden was the best president or Barack Obama or Donald Trump, don't care. But eventually your guy will be out of favor, the other guy will be in. And do you really want to give government more control over $3 trillion? Or is it a better solution to give a $3 trillion one-time tax cut? Put that $3 trillion back into the economy. Let it go to normal, regular people like you and me. There's only so many things we can do with money. And I don't care if you're normal or if you're Jeff Bezos. There's only some things you can do. You can spend it, which helps build the private economy. You can save it, which gives capital for people to buy homes and cars and things like that. Or you can invest it. Those three things are productive. So if the government gives you back that money, because it's your money to begin with, if it's coming in from a tax, if they give a $3 trillion one-time stimulus to the U.S. economy, you'd see this economy boom. So I would be one to much more strongly support if we have a $3 trillion surplus in tax revenue because of tariffs or because of whatever, I would strongly propose that we give that money back to the people. If we pay down debt with it, which sounds really good and that sounds nice, but if we do that, you know what's going to happen? They're just going to run the debt back up. And that $3 trillion will be evaporated. How about you give it back to us? And if you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, an Independent, I hope you can see the logic in that. We, the people, pay the taxes. Companies don't pay taxes. Enterprises don't pay them. We, the people, do. When you raise company taxes, they just raise prices. The free market, and I say this with conviction because I've talked and met with and worked with former Soviet people. They worked in a government-controlled market. It does not work. What Mandami's doing in New York will not work. And again, for the young people who might watch this, study history. Free stuff always sounds good. I understand that. The economy is always difficult to get started in. It's never easy. It's better today and easier than it's been in 1,000 years, but it's still hard, and I understand that. But getting free stuff from the government means somebody has to pay it. Government doesn't have its own money. It only gets what it takes from you and me. So you're saying, take from this person, give me free stuff. Well, eventually that person's going to say, I'm done. I'm out of here. And in New York, you're going to see an exodus of tax-paying citizens. We're seeing that in Illinois right now. The tax rates in Illinois are so high, the wealthier people who can afford to are leaving. Well, that shrinks the tax base, shrinks the taxes, and therefore they have to raise the taxes on the remaining people. That's going to happen in Mondami's, New York. I have an idea there. You want government-run grocery stores? How about take that money and give it to the private grocers in a tax cut? Let the private grocers go out. Let them work with that money. I guarantee you'll see a much more productive use of the money. Where we've seen government-free grocery stores, they haven't worked very well. And I go back to the sovereign fund. Do you think the government will actually manage a sovereign fund well? I don't. I have no faith in the government's ability to manage its way out of a paper bag. It's shown that. That's history. It's proven that. And the government solution is always, well, give me more money. Well, no, if any business operated like that, they'd be bankrupted. So what we want is the free market. And I know this, people don't understand it, and it's harsh, and it sounds hard, but we want the free market to dictate where capital goes. It does a much better job than government ever will. And therefore, a sovereign fund, in my mind, I think it's a bad idea. Now, I think it's interesting that Trump brings it up. I think it sparks an interesting debate. Why do some countries run, they're tiny economies compared to ours, why can they run such big surpluses? That's part of the reason that the administration has gone down this tariff route. We're running trade deficits every year. Why? Because a lot of the free trade stuff done in the 80s didn't reciprocate. While the U.S. dropped its tariffs, other countries didn't. And we shoved the middle class into these other countries. It's obvious. It's very blatant. So if you were coming out of that middle class, we overregulated, overtaxed, and then threw on top of that unfair trade. No wonder the manufacturing jobs went out. Now, Obama's point was they're going to be taken off by the digital economy anyway. This goes back to about 2014 when he said, you're never going to bring those jobs back to the U.S. I don't disagree with that. I wrote a book called The Coming Digital Economy. I think we're headed toward that. But there's a long runway here. And I think we're seeing, this is, the third quarter of 2025, we're seeing manufacturing actually picking up here in the United States because we are resettling some of those manufacturers to the U.S. That's a good thing for everybody. But it doesn't support the idea of a U.S. sovereign fund. As I said on the radio in a recent interview, it's a bad idea. And it's a bad idea because giving government more control over more percent of the economy will not end well. It may sound good and it may have beautiful intentions, but at the end of the day, you and I will pay for a slower economy, a higher tax rate, and it will be harder yet for young people to get ahead. If you guys, and if you're in your early 20s and you think prices are a problem, you're right. Government spent so much money that it caused prices to go up. There's your inflation cause. When government exceeds its spending ability, we have to borrow money. That creates inflation because we print more and more money every year too. You devalue your dollar. Sometimes economics is common sense, and supply and demand and some of these fundamental rules drive it home. But I want you to at least engage in a dialogue and a debate. Look what a sovereign fund is. Make your own decision. Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? But as you look at it, take it into the context, too, of the political dialogue in this country. What is the Mondami effect? What's driving that? And I would argue that a lot of that is because politicians are creating discord and discontentment among the people. They go out and make money giving speeches about how bad it is and about how billionaires and oligarchs run the country. They're making millions of dollars off of you because they're ginning you up to tell you a story about the envy you should feel toward the wealthy people. I would simply argue that that's the wrong way to think about it. We live in a can-do economy, not a can't-do economy. You can build your own wealth if you want to, and I'll help you do it. But the fact of the matter is, we need to be careful and watch out for this stuff. So I appreciate it. I just wanted to come today because the historical perspectives on this are all over the place. As governments get more control over an economy, economies slow down. And I think this sovereign fund, even though you may say, well, this is Trump, it's different. It's not different because ultimately it won't be Trump. It'll be somebody else. And it may be your guy or my guy or whose guy, but whoever that person is, they're not going to be as efficient as allocating capital as a private sector person who has a personal interest in that allocation. I mean, those of you who have a 401k, do you really want Washington running your 401k? Really? Do you trust a bureaucrat to make that decision, or would you rather work with a private financial advisor? So I think that you've got a real debate here. But as we go through time and with the digital economy coming on stream, it's more important than ever that we stay informed on what's going on. We stay sovereign and we stay free, because freedom in the extreme is what we need to carry this economy through the digital age. Thanks as always for watching. I'm Steve Beeman.